Welcome to the Triclinium, a podcast named after the three-sided table used in the Lord's Supper, where you're invited to join the three of us as we think through matters of Christian faith, practice, and community. My name is Eric Bergers, and I'm here with my co-hosts Jacob Hawley and Nate Lead. And today we're going to be discussing the Second Commandment, not the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment, as we've done in the past. Wow, that's a tongue twister. Amendment. Anemone. Talking about the Second Commandment, icon usage. We'll probably talk about, I imagine, icon veneration will pop up. Lots of big words that I just brought up that will probably need some breaking down as we go along.
Yes. What's the simple? What's the simple?
I was gonna say the simplistic definition is we're talking about images of God, images of Jesus, who is God, but there's some distinctions there we'll probably get into. Images of certain things and how the church relates to images, I guess is probably the best way to put it. That being said, well, let's start. How are you guys doing? Are you looking forward to this one?
I'm beginning to realize my ignorance. It's just now that it's dawning on me how little I feel like I could really argue for my perspective here. So we'll see how this goes.
Yeah.
Before this, Jacob thought he knew everything.
Yeah. Now, the 10 seconds before we started recording this podcast, I was like, "Man, I'm so ready." And now I'm like looking at the passage, and I'm like,
I'll start by saying I don't have like a super settled view myself of this. Like, I'm looking forward to the conversation because I'm hoping to glean something more by your guys' perspectives on this. That being said, I want to make it clear, like, for those who might be listening, like, this issue is extremely complex. There's been multiple, and I mean multiple, like, historical church councils, statements, confessions, like, essentially a millennia plus amount of time of arguments between different camps on where the Christian church aligns on this particular issue. There's going to be some that take a more hardline stance, saying things such as the Eastern Orthodox Church that you must venerate icons or else you're damned. Like, I'm being as straightforward as possible. I'm not making this up. You can check statements from scholars and apologists from their camp. That's pretty much how it is. I didn't realize it was
that heavy.
It is, yeah. The seventh. So one little historical thing: the Seventh Ecumenical Council, Nicaea II, as it's known, speaks about icon veneration. It's kind of almost a response council. In response to, I think, the Council of Ephesus, I believe it was, which preceded that council, which was a hardline iconoclast council, meaning that no images whatsoever should be used in the church, like, in any sense at all. And
which
that
is followed by an iconoclasm, right? So basically the destruction of a ton of icons by... Correct.
Yeah. So yeah, many people were going around destroying images and icons and things like that in different churches. So that's almost, some people would probably object to this language, but a retaliation council where it goes in the complete opposite direction. And, kind of like you see at the end of the Nicene Creed where it says those who don't hold to the faith are, I think, like, bound to hell is what it says, or something, if I remember right. Where Jacob wasn't a big fan. But essentially the same thing. Like, this has been the apostolic faith passed down. If you don't do this practice or are in step with this practice, like, you're going to hell. And
so that's how tightly
it sounds severe.
Some traditions hold to it.
Yeah, it sounds severe, but that's the fact of the matter, and they'll hold to that to this day.
Yeah. And
then, of course, there's more intermediate positions on it, which we can get into as well. But nevertheless, this is a hotly debated issue, one that's extremely unsettled. I would say amongst all traditions, it would seem all traditions have different viewpoints on this issue. And so I'm not going to sit here and claim like I have like the
I have the truth.
perspective, but I'm going to lay out where I'm at personally as well,
Sure.
and I expect that's what both of you will do too. So
Yeah.
So yes, it is that serious. It is that serious. You can go read, for those who are listening, the Seventh Ecumenical Council for yourself. It's some interesting stuff in there. But
Yeah.
nevertheless,
So let's get started with this. I mean, let's kind of talk about where it first came out of. Like, when did this practice first start? For one, even of making icons of Christ, of the Father, of the Spirit, and also, so are these icons in relation to saints and Mary as well?
yeah. I don't even think you realize how complex of a question that is, because that historical fact is what's disputed even today. As I mentioned, I'm not sure so much about Roman Catholicism, but Eastern Orthodoxy will hold that icon veneration, and maybe I should give a quick summary from their perspective of what that is. Like, icon veneration does not mean to them worship in the sense like that we give to God. It's almost like a directing. I think the way that I've heard it put by some Eastern Orthodox people is like, it's like a window into heaven. It's like a directing point that is supposed to, hopefully from their perspective, is supposed to like point us to Christ, essentially. And not doing that is a serious offense in their ecclesial position. So, so that being said, they will claim that icon veneration, as I just laid it out, goes back to the apostles. It's an apostolic tradition that's been held to this day. The Protestant church, that's a very broad category, but I would say probably most Protestant traditions will reject the idea that the use of icons or the practice of having icons in the church is apostolic. It's not in the scriptural account. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that most people that I listen to or read will say that icon veneration doesn't even pop up at all until at least 300 AD, if not after. And on top of that, most mention of the early church fathers, as they mention icons, from my point of view, where I'm at right now, seems to be aniconic. They're against the use of images in the church. Obviously, that's a disputed statement that I said. Everything that I'm going to say is disputed. So it's going to be disputed one way or another.
So maybe to ground this a little bit more, we're 8 minutes in, and I think we've used so many words now that are like outside of our tradition and kind of foreign to our understanding, that I could see a lot of listeners just kind of being like, why is this important? Like, what's at stake if we say, he either we can or cannot use icons, or specifically, like, because we don't use the word icons, can make images, can paint pictures, can draw images of Jesus or of the Father or of different saints. Like, what's the different Christians in the past? What we have a portrait of Jesus in our house. What's the big issue, Eric? What's going on there?
Yeah. So to steer the conversation, and this is what I think. Hopefully, I was getting to. I was trying to lay the groundwork of how like complex
disputed,
and how serious this issue is amongst people.
And you did a really good job of that.
It very much is.
Yeah.
But I want to, as you're saying, Jacob, I think the purposes of our conversation is we're going to try to be a bit more scriptural about this argument approach. Can we make pictures or images of Jesus from a biblical standpoint? And maybe survey the biblical evidence for that a little bit. Again, we're not experts and we don't know all of the arguments throughout Scripture, but I have some in mind, and I'm sure you guys do as well. And then maybe if we come across some things that are necessary in church history, we'll bring that into. But so, from a biblical standpoint, maybe just lay out what you guys are thinking right now personally. Like, can we make a picture or an image of Jesus And then I think even to go further, which we should do down the line here, after you guys say what you said at some point, I think there might be a difference between that and something like The Chosen. Like, not just pictures of Jesus, but films of Jesus. Like, entire, like, video recordings in some form or another that display Jesus Christ of Nazareth.
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
let me just throw this in here because I think this is really important to set the stage for what me and Nate will respond with here. Here's why some people would get worried about painting an image or making an image of Jesus or of otherwise. It goes back to the Ten Commandments. The second commandment is, and this is why we call it the second commandment, this episode, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth below or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. That's Exodus 20, verse 4. So, 4 through 6. So, that's kind of the question mark around all of this. That's where this is what it all pivots on, is if Jesus is God, as the creeds have been very clear in stating, if we believe that Jesus not only is like kind of like God, but is God, is the incarnation of God, then we have to wrestle with the question of whether or not this second commandment applies to him as well as to the, you could say the transcendent or unseen God of Israel, like, the what some fathers would call the logos sarkos, right? The word without flesh. So that's kind of to set the scene a little bit.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Nate, I want to know yours. Do you have like a perspective on this at all to begin with?
Man, yeah, I think much like you, Jacob, and Eric as well, just like understanding the complexity of the issue, it's making me take a step back. Because even before, it was like, yeah, I'm sure that I could, have an opinion on this, and it's not that big of a deal. That's kind of the perspective coming into this, and now it's like, oh, this does matter, certainly. So I don't want to put my foot in my mouth immediately. I think right now, because I think we've talked a little bit about both sides, and I think I can understand at least a little bit on both sides of the issue of icons versus no icons.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I'd like to explore this issue maybe just from more of a neutral stance and not try and declare a right side.
Yeah.
All right.
Versus just staying neutral and trying to understand both sides. Because this is a complex issue, and I'm certainly not smart enough, for one, nor have the background knowledge to approach a conversation like this and argue for one side or the other.
I think you're smart enough. You just maybe haven't spent the time yet to think through. That's okay.
Yeah, and maybe this will serve as an introduction to this issue for a lot of our listeners, which is great. And I think that, for one, Eric, you've done a great job of framing it in the right way, and Jacob, I really appreciate you bringing in the actual second commandment. So, yeah, I'm excited for this. I know we're already 14 minutes in, but I think this is going to be a good conversation. So
sweet.
Yeah, so I'm glad you did bring in.
For right now.
That's funny. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up. Yeah, as I mentioned even in the intro, like largely a lot of this conversation amongst all traditions is going to hinge upon some sort of understanding of the second commandment. You can probably make arguments outside of the second commandment here and there, and not just probably. I'm sure there's people out there that have.
Sure.
But a huge sway, even I would say amongst just pop evangelical culture today, is going to hinge upon the second commandment. So I think we should probably start there and then maybe go elsewhere later. But I can maybe lay out like kind of where I'm at right now with it personally, and then we can go from there, and we can hear yours, Jacob, and see where we land. So when I spoke with Jacob about maybe talking about this a couple of weeks ago, I probably would have been more on the side of no images whatsoever in the church, like a hardline view of the second commandment, where I mean, to people's credit, seemingly on its face, it seems like it's saying don't make any images of gods or of a deity, which would seem to include Yahweh himself, which we believe is Jesus Christ in the incarnation. To kind of give that argument some water, I guess, in where I was before, where I still might be now, to be honest, because I'm still a bit unsure. Kind of the main argument that will be used for like no icons coming out of the second commandment will be that that crowd will say something like, the second commandment has to be saying that you can't make images even of God himself, because it's not meant to just be a repeat of the first commandment. So like when you read the second commandment, it says don't make any images, and then it goes on to say like don't bow down before them. And so people will say that's the context to say that, well, it's not saying not to make any images whatsoever. It's saying don't worship images. Like don't give your devotion and worship to them. And the response from the other side of the aisle, like I was just saying, will be something, well, that's just basically repeating what the first commandment just said. God just said don't worship other gods. Why would God just repeat himself from the first commandment to the second? I'm still not sure I have a great answer against that. I'm sure that answers out there exist, and maybe this is where you can hop in, Jacob. But in all fairness, like hermeneutically speaking, how we interpret that text, the second commandment itself, like on its face does seem to be saying like don't worship images. Like there's a distinction between like just don't worship other gods directly and don't worship like other gods like through the means of images. So I think, I don't know, like I probably lean more towards the latter personally, where it's like don't worship other gods through the means of images themselves. I'll pause there. I want to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah. So I stand in the pro icon camp, and not veneration. I wouldn't go as far as the East. Although I would probably go farther than most Protestants would, and I would say that that imagery is actually a huge part of worship, and ought to be held as such. So here's kind of like my take on the second commandment particularly. It says, "You shall not make for yourself an image." So this is, I'll start back a little bit just so we have the context. And God spoke all these words. So this is the giving of the Ten Commandments. "I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." So there's the first commandment. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. There's the first. Second commandment. "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or in earth beneath, or in waters below. You shall not bow down to them or to worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Right? So then he goes on from there. Here's how I would see what's going on there. I think what an image means is lost to us in our modern context. I don't think what he's saying here is you shall not have any pictures, or you shall not have any likenesses. I think what he's saying is something more like what an image is, like in the ancient world, from what I understand, is almost always an idol. Like specifically the talisman that was worshipped in direct relation to the god that was being worshipped, right? So you would worship this idol, and it would be like you are worshiping the encapsulation of the god that was there in the stead of the idol.
That's a
and
good point to bring up.
And I
Yeah.
don't think that that's how we see images played out. So here's an example of that. In the temple, there were carvings of pomegranates, carvings of angels, carvings and images, you could say, statues of all these different things, right? It says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below." So if we're to say there's no images, we're not saying there is to be no images used in worship. We're saying no images at all. Like, all art is out the window, because it's all art, right? Like, it's everything you could possibly imagine or conceive of in the earth or in the heavens or down below cannot be used in worship. But obviously, the temple was adorned with a lot of these things. So either God is contradicting himself here,
yeah.
or we're misunderstanding what he means when he says image. I believe the word that's used in Hebrew is tselem. I might be wrong. I'm trying to look it up, and I'll get it here in a second. But tselem is like an idol. It's a... Oh no, I don't think it is tselem. I think it's something else. But I do believe that the direct connection to the word is the statue, the artifact that was used in religious worship, like as the god itself. So I think what we're to take away from this is a twofold truth about who God is. First off, we're monotheists. We only believe there's one God, right? So there is no other gods before him. So it is to some degree an extrapolation out of the first. It's a commentary. It's a nuancing of the first. It outpours from the first commandment. I think the second thing, though, is that even though we are monotheists, even beyond that, our God is transcendent and will, like, anything that we picture to try to, like, encapsulate him. And to worship him. Anyway, you could say, tether him down so that he looks like a fish, or he looks like a frog, or he looks like a shepherd, or he looks like a sheep, or he looks like whatever else, is not going to encapsulate the fullness of who he is. So when we think about how we're using images, and this would be my push into something like where we need to be careful with icons or images or any kind of representation of God, is that we do not associate one for one, as the people did in this day, the physical representation, the material representation of who God is, with with himself, right? So the to extrapolate it out to where we're at now, the guy who plays Jesus in The Chosen is not to be looked at as some sort of reincarnation of Jesus. When we see the cloud painted in representation of the God of Israel, we're not to believe that God is one for one related to a cloud, right? And we're not to see, like, carvings or images of those things as encapsulating or containing the God in themselves. I think that's where we draw the line, and I think that because we live in a postmodern society rather than pre-modern or even modern, I think we are so far from believing that material things hold some sort of, like, divine power that, like, you would basically have to be Eastern in order to maintain anything like what is being depicted here as false. I think we almost, by nature of the culture and like the waters that we swim in, are exempt, you could say, from the fear. In fact, I would say, obviously, there's a lot of problems with modernism and modernity and postmodernism, and like where we're at with the mystical and with the supernatural. Like there are far more plagues than benefits in that. But this could be one of the benefits, is that we don't see anything as really containing God in that sense. Like nothing can tie him down like that. So there's my, like, sweeping overview of the second commandment and how I would read it. Is I think it's specifically talking about relics used in worship.
Yeah. Yep. I think I'm closely in line with you, I think, at the moment. So,
Yay!
yeah, the reason the reason I moved away from a more hard line, like no images whatsoever, is like it would seem silly to me to say that you can't have images, and then you go and you read in the Old Testament that there were images in the temple itself.
Right,
Like,
right.
I haven't heard. This is where I got to do more research. I haven't heard any responses to that
Yeah.
from the no images crowd, and to be honest, I can't think of a way that you could like super reasonably respond to that right now off the top of my head.
Yeah, it would be difficult.
And the temple and the tabernacle are separate, right? They're different.
Yes, yeah, they're two
Yes,
different
correct.
like housing
Yeah.
Okay.
facilities.
In my mind, I was thinking about the tabernacle because the tabernacle was supposed to be, supposed to be a dwelling place for the Lord that mirrored heaven.
Mhm.
You know, because the Lord wasn't able to actually be physically in the world, so he had to have a dwelling place
Yeah,
that mimicked heaven.
yeah.
So,
Maybe you could
I
say.
was thinking about that.
Maybe you could say somehow that was supposed to apply to the tabernacle that I'm not aware had images in it itself as they moved.
I think just the ark.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's
The
where
ark
I was
was
gonna.
adorned.
That's where I was gonna go. Is the ark had cherubim and seraphim on it, if I'm not mistaken. So then I don't know how you get out of that from
Right.
there.
Right.
On top of that, some other biblical cases that I was gonna say aside from the temple itself is like the account where I believe it's Moses, holds up the serpent and people have to look to
Yeah.
the serpent.
Great example.
Yeah, look to the serpent as literally in order to be healed from the snakes that God was imposing
Right.
on them. If we can't use images or certain likenesses, I'm just not sure how you get around like condemning God Himself for doing specific
Yeah.
things.
Yeah.
So, but to your credit, Jacob, like there has to be a line because I think if I remember correctly, like in practice, I'm not sure that Eastern Orthodox people would say that like maybe they would say there's some sort of divine liturgy because they use that language in
Yeah.
the images themselves. But assuming that they don't, it's the in practice element that I think for me condemns Eastern Orthodoxy as going too far to where I think it would steer their distinction between like worship and veneration that they give, where they will say that veneration isn't the same thing, like it's veneration is just pointing us to Christ. We don't like give our devotion and worship to the image itself as if it were Christ Himself.
Right.
Doesn't work for me because like thinking practically about what worship looks like and what you do like as a representation of that, like their idea of veneration includes things like bowing down to the image, kissing the scriptures or the images themselves.
Yeah.
Like I know that this breaks open a can of worms when I say this too, but even like the veneration of the saints and the invocation, which is another word for say prayers to the saints as well, in my opinion violates that principle of worship as well, the biblical principle of worship too.
Yeah.
So like in practice, like those practices just go too far in my opinion, and they step into categories that I think are worship themselves.
Yeah.
So that would be going too far, but I also don't I'm in step with you where I want to say now, like at this point in time, like I don't think biblically speaking that we can just ban icons altogether or images altogether.
Yeah.
So there has to be some sort of space for it, and that's probably what I'm wrestling through at the moment.
Absolutely. I think to add to that last bit about the form of liturgical practice that icons, the place in their worship that they play, I think there are many theologians in the Eastern Orthodox tradition that understand the distinction between veneration and worship and would be able to articulate that. I think the fear, and maybe this goes to your point, is how many of the lay understand that theology, and how many of them are being, I could say like with when it comes to like Catholic brothers and sisters who make practice of invocation of the saints, of praying to the saints. Like when it's been explained to me, it makes sense. There's some things that we can't hold as Protestants because we're missing like certain metaphysics that they hold to, such as like the lack of division between the dead and the living, right? So I think that's a big thing, right? But for them, for those who are able to articulate that doctrine, it would be something like, well, I ask my friends to pray for me.
Yes.
So why not? If there is no division between the living and the dead, if the dead are alive in Christ, then why not pray to Mary, or really specifically pray through, right? Ask them to pray for me, right? Because that's what's really happening.
Right.
But
the saints that are in heaven are not dead; they're alive.
They're alive,
essentially.
and they're going to God on your behalf, right? That's the idea.
Yes.
So it's really just like asking your friends to pray for you, in the theological articulation, right? But that's
Yes.
not how you see it played out, because that's complicated, right? So this is where like theology can become a stumbling stone. If
Yes.
people don't understand that, now you have people who are praying to Saint Anne or Saint whoever because they genuinely believe that saint has the power to heal them or to provide for them or
Yes.
whatever else, and all of a sudden it looks a whole heck of a lot like idolatry.
An example too is you get places like in South America, so I've heard, where cathedrals have these giant candlelit shrines, if you will, that are dedicated to Mary or some saint.
Yes.
And you have Jesus's little table in the corner with his one candle, and that's, I think even Roman Catholics would say that's unacceptable in theological theory,
Right.
But these are the practical realities that I think are undeniably happen in different parishes and church plants around the globe. So yeah, it's really like it's twofold for me at the moment. It's one, in practice, there seems to be a division amongst scholars and teachers in the laity itself, where in practice there does seem to be a transgression of worship, as you're saying. But even amongst the scholarly community and the theologian community as well, like biblically speaking, the categories that they speak in, even though if they're able to somehow articulate it, just seem to contradict the scriptural model for worship, and that I would understand as well. Like I see some of their arguments and I see some of their logical steps that they take, but I can't get around it. Specifically with prayers to the saints, as you were making, like prayer inherently seems to be wrapped up with worship, that as far as I can tell in the biblical account. So I would extend that to practices that surround images as well. So for that reason, I would not go as far as those communions in their understanding of images. But like I think we're both saying, and maybe we should start hammering this out a little more, is like there does seem to have to be some space for images, like in the church today. So maybe we could talk about what the New Testament has to say about images, maybe, if there is. I'm not aware of much in the New Testament. It's sparse, if there is some.
Yeah, I wouldn't attempt to create a positive theology around it, because I don't really know that it would be I think it would be on sand, right? Like we would be having to make a lot of inferences.
Yeah. I know this is where the incarnation comes in for people.
Sure.
And how that relates as like Jesus Christ being the icon or the image pointing to God, the Father himself.
Sure.
So, but outside of that, outside of the incarnation, I'm not aware of many, if any, New Testament accounts regarding images. But
yeah.
So maybe I should back up and say, like, in your guys' view, like, what is the role of images? You were saying it's important, Jacob, in the role of, even in worship, as you would say. But like, what does that mean? And like, where do you draw the line, maybe, and like how practically does the church involve images in the church setting, I guess.
Yeah. So I'll answer that. First, I want to ask Nate because I haven't heard from him in a bit. Nate, how are you feeling about the conversation so far? Like, what's
this
stuck
has been a
out
great
to you?
conversation. There's a question on my mind, but it's kind of shifting topics a little bit.
That's all right.
Still in this discussion, but so I'll ask that question after Jacob, you
Okay.
say what you wanted to say.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I guess I frame my understanding of images as like beyond, or as you could say, like semiotic, right? So having a relation to symbols, signs and symbols, and how those work out. I would say that there is a degree to which all words are symbols that point to a reality beyond themselves. And those words are always, to some degree, incapable of expressing the whole of a situation. And this is why we need so many words to kind of like box in more deeply and to nuance and to get down to the nitty-gritty details of what something is, right? So I think as long as you have that framework for what language is, and then you could say picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So if we're going to, there's some truth to that there is a way in which pictures and words are correlated to one another. I would say pictures, as long as they're understood as not containing a reality in and of themselves, but as pointing to a reality and bearing witness to it and being a symbol of it, right? I think we don't cross any boundaries. So I would say, I would say, insofar as we use images in worship, I think we can go crazy. Like I don't see a lot of, maybe go crazy as a pejorative or maybe an uncareful way of saying it. But I think that I don't think there's any limitations in worship beyond, unless we believe that there is a direct correspondence between a word or an image and it's the thing that it's pointing to. So if there's a direct, if we believe that when we say, let's say we say a certain word, and that word contains some sort of divine energy about it, or has a way of tethering God down to us, then I think that we've gone too far. If we do the same with an image, we see this image is the embodiment of this God, right? Or is where God rests and lies. There, I think we've gone too far. Which is where in questions of communion, right? So Eucharist will come up in this, right? Because we're talking about signs and symbols. I do fall along a more Zwinglian line. I would say I think that we need to maintain some distinction between divinity and the way that it, the divine will works, the freedom of God to do as He wills and to be free from human willing and wanting and trying to trap Him. You can't trap God, right? So the thing with communion, especially when it comes to the very high church, right? So the apostolic lineages, right? So Catholicism, Orthodoxy, even some Lutheran confessions, though I think Lutheranism does draw some more lines here and it makes some more nuances. You can't say that Jesus is contained within the cup or contained within the bread. I really don't think that that's a good idea, because I think you're creating out of something tangible and controllable, manipulatable, the very essence of God, and God is not maintainable or manipulatable in that sense. So that would be my caution. That's where I would draw my line, is I would say anytime you're equating something on earth with the divine reality, you've gone too far.
How would you feel about, I mentioned earlier, practices such as bowing to the scriptures or certain images, or kissing them, or things along that nature?
I would have a pastoral objection, not necessarily a theological one, but more a pastoral one. I would just say there are certain things that you can do in a context of other people that send off signals that will be misread, right? So,
Okay. Yeah, I
like,
see where you're going.
like I think, I'm trying to think about a good example that's outside of this that could be helpful. Okay, I mean, like, we talked about this, like, briefly. If you were to set up a mission to go and talk to, let's say, prostitutes, and to try to, like, evangelize to women on the street, that's a really good thing. If men do it, from the outside, people might be thinking, hey, that pastor and his congregation are going to get prostitutes. And they're not going to ask you whether or not you're doing that. Most people won't ask. They'll just assume that's what you're doing. This is a really caricaturized version, right? Like, obviously there's more nuance. But, like, it's a similar thing to that. So it's like, maybe have women do it, right? Maybe have like a, some way of telling the world, hey, I'm not going and getting a prostitute right now. Like, be wise about it, because otherwise you run into problems. So I would say, in the same sense, if you're gonna bow down to some sort of an image or an icon, in your heart you might be right before God. It might be that you totally understand that you are not bowing down to the thing itself, but to the God who it represents, that it points to, that it witnesses to. Great, wonderful that you have that. If a new person comes into your church and doesn't know that, or especially if they come from an Eastern context where that genuinely does mean that you believe that there's something tangibly divine about the thing that you're bowing down to.
Do they believe that? I'm not sure.
Specifically, like, not just Eastern Orthodox. I'm talking broadly Eastern. Yeah, I would say that, like.
Oh,
like,
then
so,
yes,
like,
yeah.
Hindu use of idols.
Yeah, they
and things
believe
like that.
there's divine presence. in-
Yeah, I would be really careful. So I guess it really depends on your context, and I would say I would veer towards not doing those things just out of the fear and the caution of what if somebody new comes to your church and doesn't understand what you're doing. I think you'd have to explain it every time.
My inclination as well is more on the side of, like, I just have such, like, a strong view of the depravity of man, like, even even when we're
Big
like
Calvinist.
yeah even when we're justified, when we are regenerated by the Spirit, like, epistemically, like, that just seems exhausting to me as well, to be like, well, am I worshiping the image? Am I not?
Right.
Am I worshiping the image,
Yeah.
or am I not? You know, like, ooh, did I like step too far that time?
Yeah.
When I said that prayer or thought that thought as I approached this image,
Right.
Like, that just seems exhausting to me, and like, I would be more prone to say that, you know, sin nature, like, is corrupted to a point, or sin nature is so serious to the point where I would err on the side of, like, maybe my heart's not in the right position as I approach this, and therefore maybe we shouldn't do that as a practice in
Sure.
general. And that, I think, goes beyond more of a pastoral objection to it, although I think your pastoral objection is sound.
Sure.
So, yeah,
I would agree with that.
yeah, the practice of those things too, like, just inherently seems to be bound up in worship itself, like bowing and kissing and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, I can't personally know someone's motivation of that, but man, if I were doing those things, I would be questioning myself all the time, like, as to where my true devotion is going.
Yeah.
You know? So,
Yeah, especially to the more, like, sensitive and conscience people.
Yes.
Like you and me. So, okay, Nate, I gotta know what you're thinking about, man. Like, I've been waiting
Yeah.
pins and needles.
For sure. No, but I do appreciate, actually, that example, Jacob, that you brought up, and I was thinking about it a little bit more. It's like, you know, to take it one step further, it'd be like, you know, a pastor having a ministry to people who work in a strip club and actually going to the strip
Right.
club.
Right.
You know, like actually, because then entering that, and you might really be there to minister to those people,
Right.
but you put yourself in a situation where to the outside, it looks like you're going to a strip club.
Right.
You know, it looks like you're doing something that you're really
Yes.
not, you know, essentially. So
I'm sure there's questions
it's
on
important-
the inside too, like internally, like personally as well, and that's where I was going.
exactly,
with my
Yes.
right,
intention.
and yeah,
So,
and to Eric, to your point, you know, it might become, wow, you know, they've spent a lot of time at the strip club. Oh yeah, they have a great ministry down there. Really, they spend a lot of time down there,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
So the intention can almost change. It can be corrupted.
Yes.
To your point,
Yes.
Eric. So yeah, great example.
uh-huh.
Okay. Any Eric? Do you have anything in response to that, or?
Not in response to that. I have something else to say, but if you have something more,
Oh.
please finish. Yeah.
Well, I was going to take us in a little bit different direction to close this out. So if you want to say something before that, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was just going to give kind of my perspective on maybe, and this is not firm whatsoever. This is some raw thoughts here. Maybe where how images might be incorporated in the church. Like
Yeah,
even
let's do it. Go ahead.
yeah, like even my church. I'm not sure you could say there's images per se, like on our stained glass windows. But we have stained glass windows, and that's supposed to represent something to somebody, you know.
Who knows what?
So-
but
Yeah, it's kind of just color. It really is kind of just colorful glass, really.
Yeah,
you
I
know.
know.
So it's like, but
it stands
you
in a
know,
tradition.
Yes, it's in a tradition. I know many Protestant churches have beautiful and image. They have beautiful stained glass and use images within the stained glass itself.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, like, to guard against sort of that epistemic uncertainty that I was talking about, like, maybe it would be good to have, like, stained glass or something like that in a church where it can produce images of, say, like, the disciples or Mary or somebody else, but no images of Christ, so that there might be no confusion amongst the laity, as like allowing that sort of confusion between, like, well, like, am I really thinking that, like, in my head as I'm praying, like, am I thinking of this image every single time, and I'm like trapping the divinity of Jesus in my understanding of this image? So, like, yeah, I don't know. Maybe a helpful use of image would be to tell stories, as I believe images are supposed to do, and instruct and inform, which I think images also do, but maybe not have Christ himself depicted so that we can guard against the misuse of the image itself.
We should just have images in those pixelated images where you have to cross your eyes to see
Yeah.
them. Only those who get it can get it.
Where the 3D glasses.
Yeah. Eric, I think I would push back, and here's where maybe you and I would differ. Like,
Those are just my raw thoughts. I'm not.
No, I
I'm not-
understand.
I'm trying to be sensitive and think through it still. So
yeah, I would say, to some degree, Christ being made man, you know, the God becoming man in Jesus Christ, is him giving us an image of what it means for God to be God. I'm reading through Hebrews right now, and the beginning of Hebrews opens up with the part where it talks about the Son being the karakter, the imprint, the representation, the image of God, right? That I think that there's a degree to which we don't need to make images because we have an image of who Jesus is, right? Or I'm sorry, of who God is. It's Jesus. He is the one we look to understand who God is. So I actually don't have as much of a problem with picturing Jesus. I would say, in fact, I mean, it's funny that you talk about maybe we shouldn't have pictures of Jesus. I have, like, back on my wall over there, probably like 100 pictures of Jesus just in this, like, collage, right? So I'm like, feeling a little called
Jesus
out.
collage.
Yeah, but I think that part of intimacy and like really like grounding our understanding of what it means for God to become human is to have images where we are relating Jesus to ourselves, because God became one of us. And beyond that, I do think that Jesus is there in his body, so it makes sense too to me to have pictures of the saints who have gone before us. Again, not for veneration or for worship, but just as representations, like in the same way that you would have pictures of your family in your house. Like, you don't believe that your family's actually in the images. That's not how our Western minds think. But that when you look at them, it reminds you of your family. I would say that's the way that I think about it. And there have been even sometimes, I'll confess that, and I don't think this is wrong, so maybe I shouldn't use the word confess, but I like, while I'm praying, I will look at one of those pictures, and I will kind of use it to think about what are the things about Jesus that this thing tells me that I'm not thinking about, right? Like, what the artist decided to portray Jesus in this certain way, this picture of him out on the storm with his disciples, or in this, this picture of him without holding the lost sheep, or whatever it is, sowing the seed of the gospel. I would say, in the same way that when I'm reading the scriptures, I ask, what does this kind of show me about the heart of Jesus? And all of my images are to some degree biblical portrayals, right? So it's not like I'm making up stories or anything like that. But I use it, like, the images will come to mind while I'm praying. And here's the thing. I think for most people, when they pray, something's coming to mind. You are picturing God in some way. So I would rather picture Jesus than picture, like, some cloud. That's what I used to picture, some sort of, like, nebulous cloud when I was praying. Some sort of, like the sky. But that's still a created thing. That's not Jesus, right? And in fact, it's almost spitting in the face of the revelation of God that he has given us, right? Of himself in Jesus. So I would actually say, if you're going to have pictures of anything in the church, man, Jesus is a good one to have. Now, obviously, the downside of that, and this kind of follows in line with the third commandment, which is to, to revere the name of God and to keep it, holy and not misuse it, is anytime you paint a picture of Jesus, there are assumptions about who Jesus is that you have to kind of make. And so you can't take any picture as gospel, right? In the same way that you can't take any sermon as pure gospel, right? They're all commentaries to some degree. But I don't think it's wrong to say that they can contain the word of God to us in them, right? That the gospel can't be preached through them, right? Because obviously the gospel is preached through sermons, and they contain a lot of things that are kind of just our speculations.
So here's my question to you, and this is a genuine question. I don't know how you might respond to this, and I've heard some responses, I think, to this question in the past from different traditions. But when we're making pictures of Jesus, like, part of what you were saying earlier is that we're not trying to encapsulate God or divinity, correct? So, like, when we're making pictures of Jesus, most people will say something like, we're depicting Christ in his humanity. And, like, when people, like, I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, but when people say things like that, it feels a bit Nestorian to me.
Yeah, that's
like,
not
when
what I'm
I hear
saying.
that.
No.
Yeah, so... well, I think the Orthodox, or the Eastern Orthodox, like, would say something like, we're venerating Christ's humanity, not his divinity, or something like that, and that feels Nestorian to me.
Yeah, you cannot separate them.
Yeah. So, Nestorianism, for those who might not know, is a heresy identified by the Church with a man Nestorius in the historic past, where he wanted to separate the two natures of Christ as distinct from one another, having nothing to do with one another, whereas we would say, the Christian Church would say that Christ's human nature and divine nature are inherently correlated with one another, unified with one another.
Yeah.
They're not separate entities.
Yeah.
As Nestorius would say.
Yeah.
So,
No,
So
yeah.
when we make pictures of Jesus, I guess my question is like, are we not encapsulating the divinity of Christ when we do that? As you were like, it seems contradictory there to me.
We're pointing towards it. So to go back to the theory that I have of like symbol and language, all pictures and all words that we use to describe God they are not the full of who God is. So you could say the big theology word, and I know we've used a lot of these for this, and I feel kind of bad, is apophaticism, right? So I'm apophatic.
I've not heard this one.
So there's cataphatic and apophatic theology, and apophatic theology, or sometimes it's called the via negativa or negative theology. So it's like God. We begin by saying God is not really
I
this,
think I know where you're going
and
with
you
this.
carve out all the things that he's not, and it leaves you with kind of an impression of what he might look like, but you can never quite say, right? Because there's no word that can fully encapsulate who he is. So I would say there's a degree of apophaticism that we have to hold with all of this, but we also have to recognize that Jesus is the revelation of God, and that Jesus uses lots of symbols and imagery for himself, right? I am the true vine. I am the bread of life. I am, in me is the living water, right? Like, there's all of these, like, and none of us are, like, going around going, well, Jesus said he's the true vine. I guess he's a real vine. Like, he's actually foliage. That's Jesus. He is a type of foliage. No one, there's a place for metaphor and for that kind of that representative language, that symbolism. So I would say all words that we speak about Jesus, all words and all pictures are they can't actually encapsulate who God is. So where you go wrong, I think, in theology, and your understanding of the image, is when you start associating, like, specifically a certain picture or a certain word with God, unwilling to be nuanced and believing that it actually does encapsulate the whole of who he is, right? So again, it's when you look at the picture and you don't say, that looks like Jesus. That's a picture, that's a representation of Jesus. It's where you start looking at that picture and you go, that is Jesus. That stained glass window, that's where he is. He's right there in that stained glass. And so I have to look at it, and I have to face myself toward it, right? It's kind of I believe Muslims will face Mecca, right, when they're praying.
Yes.
Sorry, I got my audio
It's all good.
messed up here. You might have heard my Zoom call there on the editing. So they face Mecca when they're praying. They feel like they have to, because that's where their devotion lies, right? And I think in some instances, but though again in the West, I don't think that we have this perspective very often. Like, we believe that there is actually power or God's real presence in a tangible thing, or in a picture, or in a word. That when we use this word, it's the word that God, that actually contains God. When we use this picture, it's the one that actually contains. So I'm not saying you can't point to. I think we just have to maintain that it's always pointing to, and never the thing in and of itself. It's always the sign and not the thing signified.
Yeah, I think, okay, I think that's a good stopping place for that part. There's some more I want to say and think about, but I want to move on to this next part of the question. I think we got to talk about The Chosen, at least briefly. It's so popular, we got to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's actually where I was going to go with it. That was going to be my
Thanks,
Yes.
Nate. Yeah, you go ahead then.
Nate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about the image of Christ, image of the Lord and saints and all that, and so I wanted to bring up popular culture, specifically TV shows and movies, because there's been a lot of movies and TV shows about Christ, and a lot of different representations. Off the top of my head, like Jim Caviezel in The Passion of the Christ, obviously Jonathan Ramey in The Chosen, and I don't know the actor's name, but I looked him up earlier, who plays Jesus in The Shack.
Oh, I never saw The Shack.
Like, Those are kind
Yeah.
of the top three that stand out in my mind
I
of
think,
like representations of Christ.
I think Willem Dafoe plays Jesus in some movie as well.
Yeah, I think you're
Yeah,
right
I
as well.
think it's the Last Temptation of Christ or something like that.
Yep, there he is.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I wanted to bring this up because specifically when we're talking about, we want to distinguish between the image that points and harkens back to Christ versus the image that is Christ. So I think that the line between that gets a little bit blurred, especially in film and TV, because like I'm thinking in The Chosen, in these movies, these actors are portraying Christ. They are not Christ, but in the story, in the movie, their character is Christ. And so I'm thinking about the impression that leaves on people, and especially like children who are very impressionable. Like if they, at a young age, are watching The Chosen, and they understand that, oh, that person on the screen is Christ, and then that image is what they view as Christ moving forward. They understand that's Christ, and then later they might understand it's a show, it's not actually, but that image is what comes to mind because that's the image that's stuck with Christ.
Yeah.
So where do we land on that? And not like we're gonna. I don't know. But what do you guys think about that potential issue of icons and imagery and portrayals of Christ in movies and TV?
I think, preempting what Jacob might say, I think his whole concept of metaphorical language still could probably apply to The Chosen as well. But, like, for me, like, it's not just the portrayal of Christ. Like, it's one thing to portray Christ in a stationary manner, like a picture might or an image might, but they're also ascribing to Christ certain emotions, reactions, like
Characteristics.
I was gonna say like metaphysical characteristics and understandings of things to him,
Right.
like what he would say, do, feel in certain situations. And like, I don't know, man, that just seems like on its face just seems dangerous to me. Like it feels, I don't like saying this about certain issues, but on this one it just feels wrong. Like it something there like feels icky about about the whole thing to me. And so because it goes beyond like a stationary metaphor like an image might do, and it starts adding whole other layers like to Christ. So perhaps like you could take my previous objection to practices such as like bowing and kissing and even apply it to this one on a even greater level, like because oh man, I lost my train of thought there, darn it.
Well, yeah, I to go off of that, I think part of the issue isn't just the representation of Christ. Even if it's a faithful representation to everything we know about Christ, film and TV still adds things that are that we don't know to be true about Christ. Much like images can.
Yeah.
They could portray, and then the issue becomes a misrepresenting Christ as well.
That too, yeah.
Like,
but you could do
an
that
image
with
of
an
Christ
image too.
Well, right, but like somebody who paints a picture of Christ who as 7 feet tall. It's like, well, that's probably not. Now and a part of this is like, how big of a deal does this? It goes back to that original question that we started this podcast with. What's at stake here? But like in that movie that Willem Dafoe plays Christ, The Last Temptation of Christ. That movie is doesn't that movie include like, or a part of the story is that Christ is in love with Mary Magdalene?
I know it does in one movie. I'm not sure if that's the one, but I know there are movies that do that.
I
That's
thought
the
it was
one.
that one.
No, it's not that
Da
one.
Vinci
It's,
Code has some questions about
No,
that, I think.
it's not Da Vinci
Right,
Code either. It's the one with like oh goodness, what's his name? I think he plays in Gladiator.
Russell Crowe?
I think there's one with Russell Crowe. Yeah. No. It's Joaquin Phoenix.
Noah.
It's Joaquin Phoenix.
Oh.
there's a movie called like Magdalene or something like that, where Joaquin
Gotcha.
Phoenix has like a romantic, like it's totally focused on Mary Magdalene and kind of follows that apocryphal narrative where like Jesus had a secret relationship. I forget which
Right.
book that is. It
I
might
can't
be the
remember
Gospel
either.
of Peter or something like
Gotcha.
that. But
So if I misspoke earlier, I apologize, and I wasn't exactly sure which movie it
Sorry,
was.
I
but,
didn't
you know,
mean
that.
to-
That is a gross misrepresentation of Christ, and that has the potential to be really damaging to somebody's understanding and imagery of Christ. So it's kind of an interesting topic. You know, it's different than a still picture. You know, that especially that is aimed at reverence towards Christ. Much different.
Yeah. I think in terms of like those movies and all of the like Life magazine or, you know, Time magazine portrayals of who Jesus is, or all of the books that have been written like the Da Vinci Code that, you know, make these assumptions. Here's my thought. To somebody who Jesus, like, who cares about Jesus and who Jesus matters to a believer in the modern era, they will read the Bible and that will flush their misconceptions. Like, not all at once, but over time, the Bible will become the standard again. The scriptures will become the anchor for their understanding of who Jesus is. For the metaphors, for the adjectives, for all the words and all the pictures that they feel comfortable with. If it's, you know, if somebody's watching those movies and going, that's who Jesus is, and then not reading the scriptures, not joining a community that reveres the scriptures, that's centered around proclaiming their message again and again, then, like, I don't even think it matters whether or not they get misled, because they're already in a really unhealthy place, right? If the one place you go to get your Jesus information is The Chosen, or, you know, whatever else, right? Whatever other movie you could put up there, The Passion of the Christ, like, you're already in a broken position, right? Like, and again, I'm not even, like, I don't even want to put the primacy of, like, the act of reading. You know, some people aren't very good at reading. But, like, if you go to church, you'll hear scriptural messages. You'll see the scriptures up on the screens or in front of you in the book, and you'll have somebody, like, actually telling you the stories for what they really are. And those, you know, those pastors will also add details and conjecture and speculate and add emotions and things to Jesus that maybe he didn't have. But over time, the more you hear those stories, you'll kind of be able to center through and discern, like, oh, I guess that was just my pastor putting that together, or oh, I guess that was just, you know, a depiction by The Chosen. It wasn't really there. So I guess maybe that's my take on it, is like, I don't think in the end the Spirit will allow the church to be deceived for very long about who Jesus is, like a genuine believer. I don't think that they'll just, that the Spirit's just gonna, like, be like, yep, you saw The Chosen, that's good enough for me, and then just, like, leave them there. And I think anybody who's left there is probably not doing very well in their spiritual life anyways. So that would be my basic approach.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to stop. So I think a good summary of what we got going on is, it doesn't seem, well, Nate, you still might be thinking through it, but from Jacob and I's perspective, the second commandment doesn't seem to outright say no images. Even within the church itself, the temple included images. There's certain biblical accounts that have things like images that are prescribed by God himself. Talked a little bit about just kind of the boundaries, I suppose you could say, of what's too far with images, how do we understand images, how might they be used in the church. I talked about that a little bit. And then talked about some of the practical uses of images in the culture as well, including things like The Chosen or The Passion of the Christ and things. And I think is like a encapsulating statement here. Like, it doesn't seem like any of us like claim objectivity on how we might use images, because we recognize this is a very complex issue, and I'm sure to most things that we said in here there's objections from multiple standpoints and traditions
Sure.
to what we might have said. Nevertheless, I think we had a pretty good genuine attempt at what
Yeah.
the biblical account will have to say about images and how a Christian might approach the idea.
Yeah.
So these things are complex. In certain traditions, there's some heavy weight that comes with how you might view images as well. But at the end of the day, as we say at the end of every podcast, we want Christ to be exalted. And from our point of view, maybe not all traditions, but there's forgiveness even on a incorrect view of images at the end of the day, as long as we trust in Christ.
Yeah.
So, yeah, anything else you guys want to say? I think that could wrap it up.
I'll add like one more note here. I think that is
Yeah.
interesting, and I hope it doesn't get us into another conversation, but it's just kind of something to think about. Is I have a buddy.
Maybe a part 2.
Maybe part 2, yeah. I have a buddy who influences a lot of my theology. I asked him this question. I was like, "What do you think about the second commandment?" And he's like, I think he said he hadn't done a lot of thinking about it, but he did say this, and I thought this was interesting, that Jesus actually locates himself within certain communities of people, and so that kind of gives us some perspective on what Jesus might look like. So, for instance, like children, right? It says, when you welcome a child, you've welcomed me. And he says, to those suffering in the church, the poor in the church, his brothers and sisters who are imprisoned or who are sick or who, are hungry or thirsty or are foreigners, right? He says, if you welcome them, you've welcomed me. And he said, so maybe it doesn't really matter the images. Maybe the icon, the image of Jesus are those people who represent him in that way. And that if you want to come to encounter Jesus in a tangible sense, that you should seek him where he said he'll be found. And I was like, wow, that's an interesting idea. So maybe beyond all of the static images that we use, right, of like a picture or a word, or even the streaming platforms that we might look to, maybe we ought to look to the living people, to the living church, to the place where Jesus has wed himself to, and seek to find him there. Maybe there will be encounters between us and Jesus where he actually said he would be, where 2 or more are gathered, where the children are, where the poor are, So anyways.
So therefore, no images.
Not no images, but maybe.
I'm kidding.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
yeah. If you're seeking for that kind of like, that sense of like encounter with Jesus that maybe images can't provide or symbols can't provide, maybe he's to be found in the people that he's wed himself to.
Well said. Yeah, I like that.
So, shall I close this?
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Triclinium. If you have any comments, questions, or topics to suggest, you can reach out to us at sophomorosofficial@gmail.com. That's SOPHOMOROS official@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and as always, may Christ